An invitation was given to us to seek first the kingdom of God, to leave behind everything, to find new meaning and purpose, to use our gifts and resources, to serve others, and be prepared to meet the needs of the least of these. What has God given you? Gifts? Talents? Resources? Purpose?
We're going to get into this for the last week, I promise. This is it. The third week on a series about money. And I'm glad that we're having this dialogue about money. Like we said last week, money really shouldn't make you miserable, but it does. We know that, right? Whether you have money or whether you don't have money, it's a miserable, uncomfortable conversation, and we're trying to figure our way around it all the time. But we talk about it because it's a part of our everyday lives. So why would we not, as a church and as church leaders, want what's best for you in these situations? We want what's best for you and your family. So I do want to thank you for taking this teaching seriously so far. Our hope really has been to encourage you along the way, to live with margin and to live on mission. That's what we talked about last week. What does it mean to be able to be free with margin and not just stretched thin on everything that we do and riding up against the guardrails? And that's really where we kind of dug our heels in last week, and we basically narrowed it down to this one specific verse that Jesus said. He said, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." When you are able to live with margin, it's because you seek first his kingdom. It's because you seek first his righteous things, and then everything else falls into place. It's kind of like that old illustration, the priorities in your life. You know, if you had this jar and you're throwing in all the sand, the little things that don't matter first, and then even more marginal things like the pebbles, and you're able to do that. And then the things that really do matter the most are the ping pong balls that try to go in, right? It doesn't really work well. But if you do that the other way around, and you put the ping pong balls in the jar and all the things that really matter, and then you throw the pebbles in there, and you think that it might be full, it's amazing how God blesses us and even allows margin in our lives with just the little pebbles, the sand in our life. So there is something to keeping Jesus first, regardless of where you stand with him or not. Keeping first his kingdom and his righteousness, and everything else can be added as well. So we're having this conversation because we talk about money every day. And like I said, this is the week 3, the last week we're doing it. And I promise you we're trying to do it for you because we care about you and the freedom and the margin in your life. So I do want to kind of shift it today for just being for you, but kind of about you, if that's okay. And you're probably getting a little nervous. But I do want you to think about yourself for a minute. If that's okay, think about yourself, not today self, not 44-year-old Ryan self, but maybe 10 years in the future, 20 years for some of you, 30, 40 years, hopefully for me. I'll probably be long gone dead 50 years from now, but some of you might be here 60 years from now. Think of yourself at about 80, 85 years old, looking back on your life. If you can do that for me, just kind of take yourself there just for a second and ask yourself this question. What do you want to be true of you and how you spent your life? How you spent your time, your energy, your money? What do you really want to be true of you? I know that we don't always think about that in the midst of the prime of our lives, but if you look forward and you think about it that way, how would you measure up? What do you want to be said of you? Now, think of someone else for me, just for a moment. And maybe it's someone that really specifically, I want you to narrow it down on someone that you truly admire, someone that you look up to, someone that you truly appreciate, and you're like, man, I really like what they've done with their life. Maybe it was someone in your close family. Maybe it was a grandparent. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone that you work with, so just an upright, upstanding citizen of this world. Maybe it was a kid that you grew up with that, and you realize that, man, that's a life that's aspiring to be like it. I don't know what it is, but think of someone that you admire as well and ask that same question. What do you know is actually true about that person? And why do you admire that? I think when we do a little bit of a litmus test of our own lives, or maybe judging or looking into other people's lives, you might ask that question, and maybe some things might pop out to you. What do you know to be true? Here's what I think whenever you're looking at someone you admire. What I think is happening, chances are that person is someone who is generous. That person is someone who is kind, someone who is compassionate, someone who is putting other people first. And you really admire them because of the way they treat other human beings, right? You admire them because they're not all in it for themselves, but you admire them because that they think of themselves less and other people more. And here's what I want you to realize when you're looking at the two, yourself or anybody else. Here's what it comes down to. People who accumulate things for themselves, here's what I truly believe. When it comes to money, they're really just two kinds of different legacies. And one is that people who accumulate things for themselves, or there's people who are sacrificing themselves for others, or sacrificing the things of this world for others. That's kind of the two camps, right? If you look at culture, like we talked about last week, culture is almost 100% about this, accumulating for yourself. That's what culture tells you. That's what it looks like. That's what you live, and some of you have bought into this system. As we called it last week, it's kind of a treasure trap, right? There's a happiness trap. You're always chasing something, and you're never, ever able to get out of it. So you're in a trap, you're in a cycle, and of course, there are things that you need, and I don't want to miss that, right? You need somewhere to live. Whether that is something that you rent, something that you own, you need a bed, you need food, you need things in your life. But then there's some things that we don't need and that kind of take us above and beyond what we need, our actual needs. Some of us might say, I don't want just a car, I want a really nice car. And I want to feel comfortable in that car, and I want to get somewhere, and I want people to like my car. I want to go on vacations. I want my family to enjoy those vacations. And we go beyond just the things that we need and to the things that we want. I want in my house furniture that I actually choose and not just something that's handed down to me, right? Sue me. We do this. This is kind of how we act, right? We have these things that we want beyond that go beyond the things that we just need. That's just kind of how this life goes. I want this or I want that for my kid, and I. We may not say this out loud, but I want to live vicariously through them. There are things that we do in our lives that we want rather than just what we need. And the culture has this nonstop onslaught of information about accumulating things for yourself. That's one legacy we could live or leave. And if you really think about life, and you want to be people that you admire, it may look something more like this. It's about sacrificing for the sake of others. So there's these two camps that you can fall into today. And today I want to spend time in each one of these categories. And I'm going to do my best. By the way, I'm going to be throwing stones at myself just as much as I am. If you think it's about you, I promise you I'm talking to myself just as much. Because I think that I've come to a point in my life where I have to decide who I want to be. Do I want to be this guy that just accumulates things for myself all the time? Or do I want to be someone who's sacrificing for the sake of others? And I think this is a very tough thing to come to a realization in. And I think some of us have done that already at some point in our lives, and some of us haven't got there yet. And we're wrestling with some things, just like I did when I was a younger man. So let me kind of shift into this illustration. Whether you have a house or not, most of us have an idea of what this realistic dream house would be in our life, what it looks like. So I started doing some research this week about what that might be. So I just typed in, just started looking up, what is the most expensive house in Oklahoma? What does that look like? I don't know if anybody else is, not Zillow. I'm not looking for a house to move into. I'm just doing this strictly illustrative purposes only, all right? I'm not looking to do this. But I went and I found the most expensive house in Oklahoma. And if you want to make your life about accumulating things, it's going to look a little something like this. I just want you to see it, okay? This is in Oklahoma City area. It sits on about 32 acres. Um, I'm going to do my best to describe this, but this mansion, clearly, in Oklahoma City, it has 19,000 square foot of living space because that's how much you need, right? 19,000 square foot of living space, and it's not in this picture yet, but there's an entertainment barn. An entertainment barn is what they call it. Has 32,000 square feet of this entertainment barn. And it has 33, here, let me see if I got this, 33 spaces for your car collecting needs that you can store everything that you need. There's all kinds of games in there. And yeah, it's not just one big pool hall. That's not what it is. There's all kinds of, there's a concert venue in here. It's amazing what is in this. Of course, its owner drives cars like this, these Ferraris. Why wouldn't you? And by the way, that's what's in the garages too. I could have went through like 15, 20 different slides in here, and we could have just all gawed at it, right? And just trying. That's not what necessarily I want to do, but there are some other things that you need. Obviously, an indoor bowling alley. Why would you not have that if you've got 19,000? Evidently, this is the living space, the square footage of the living space. It has this really tiny backyard oasis, just a little getaway. It's like Disney World. That's what it looks like to me. Lounge chairs all around. Just a nice little entertaining spot for you and a couple of friends. And it's worth $17.25 million. Here's another view of it at night, just so you guys can dream a little bit. This is what accumulating things for yourself looks like. It's just bottom line what it is. And if any of you have a place like this, I'm sorry, I'm not pointing things out for you. But please let us know so we can come and do some church stuff over there. So $17.25 million is an insane amount of money, right? We can all agree that's a lot of money. But here's what's interesting about this, because I was trying to find out details like who owns a place like this. Here's the reality. You don't even know the name of the person who owns this stuff. It is, you never heard of it before, but of course it's a local businessman is what it said in the article I was reading, but it's a defense contractor. Yeah, sure. You wonder how he gets his money. But this is what happens whenever you accumulate stuff. You accumulate, all for someone that really you don't even know who this person is. He's not even well known. But some of you kind of look at this and you're like, okay, you kind of cringe a little bit because you know what you grew up in. And some of you are like dreaming like, oh yeah, that's sweet. And I can't even afford to stay at an Airbnb that looks like this. Yeah, so it's very tough for us to kind of put into our minds what this reality is. But there's a line between enough and too much, right? Between decent and just ostentatious, right? That there's a line between nice and outrageous, and I think we know maybe a little bit of what that line is in our lives. And eventually, when you cross that line, you have to ask yourself this question: is that actually a life well lived? Well, it looks pretty, but is it actually a life well lived? I think a lot of us would probably say, yeah, I kind of like to live there, Ryan. Get off me. But you might ask yourself that question: is it actually a life well lived? Or is this a life well lived? And I don't even know that I need to tell you this person's name. You know who it is. And this lady's been dead for over 25 years. And we know her name. And we know who she is. We know what she did. We have an idea of who Mother Teresa is. What is a better life lived? Someone who accumulates things or someone who sacrifices for others in everything that they did? I mean, this lady, she had, here's how much she sacrificed. She had deformed feet. And what we know is that she had that because she always wore the undersized shoes because she gave away shoes that would have been best for the children. I mean, that's just the epitome of her life. And life by life, she just went by person, changing the world through her sacrifice. And then she was sainted for it, right? That's exactly the opposite of accumulating things. And if you consider these two categories long enough, you realize that there really isn't many inspiring stories of accumulation, but there's hundreds of inspiring stories of self-sacrifice. Think about that. Think about where you are in the end, or 85, wherever you are in your life. What would you rather be? Who would you rather be? Here's the problem. And there's always a problem, right? Problem is you can't see greed in the mirror. And I'm not saying that that person who built that is just straight up greedy. I'm not saying that, maybe a little bit. But you can't see greed in the mirror. You can't really realize what's going on in your own life, but you can absolutely see other people's greed, right? Oh, my sister's greedy, or my dad, he's a greedy person. He does everything for himself. Or you might think my neighbor is greedy, or that guy at work is greedy. Someone you knew in high school, yeah, they're crazy greedy. We can always see the greediness in someone else, but you can't really see greed in the mirror. Here's what I do know. You didn't wake up to say this to yourself, man, I'm pretty greedy. I need to get up and get myself to church today. No, nobody said that. That's not why we're here, even though that might be some of our symptoms and how we live our life, but that's not why we're here. You can't see in the mirror. But I do want to show you a surefire way, and you've seen this before, of how to antidote this. You can see greed in your bank account. That's where you really see greed. Anybody heard that before? You see it in your ledger. If you really want to analyze things and where you are. And here's what I mean by this. If I look at my purchases and I go down that list, I don't know if anybody does this still, but you know where you spent your money. And if 100% of those purchases are about me alone, or my family, then I could probably, bottom line, say, oh, I'm a greedy person. I do all these things for me. Everything that I spend is for me. All right, oh yeah, Ryan, I do these for my kids. You got to understand, we're trying to give our kids the best life they can. Sure, I'm sure that there's some things there, but there's also a slippery slope there about raising entitled kids that get everything, right? We have to be smart on this. But that doesn't not make us greedy. I think we are greedy people. I really started to wrestle with this whenever I was a young adult, and I realized early on that I'm pretty greedy, because I look at my bank account and I knew what was going on. And when I started really, like, remember the word we didn't use last week, when I started really budgeting or going on a spending plan, I started realizing, oh man, this is not really how I would like it to look whenever I'm 80, 85 years old. But I can look at myself and be honest with myself about that. And I realized pretty early on that I'm a greedy person. And I think maybe that describes some of you too. Maybe. I'm just going to guess that some of us in here are the same way. But most of us will never see that in the mirror. We won't ever slow down and try to do that litmus test for ourselves. And just, let me say this. Just because you're greedy doesn't mean you're a narcissist. So I'm not stepping on everybody's toes here, right? Doesn't mean you're a narcissist. The reality is, if you're greedy, it just might mean you're a little insecure. You might want to look a little different than others. It doesn't mean that everything's about you all the time. It's just we operate different. It just means that we're a little self-centered, not necessarily narcissistic all the time, and there is a difference. Now, I hope you understand that when I say you can't see greed in the mirror, that doesn't mean you can't do anything about it. But if my bank account, again, is 100% about myself, then by default, I'm a greedy person. And I say all this, and I'm trying to roll out a little bit of an intro that's longer than normal, because I want to set up something that we're going to go in Matthew 25 today, and we're going to see how Jesus treats this and really what he's trying to give us as an antidote to this. I think a lot of people in our culture think, well, it's just the rich people are greedy. Rich people are greedy. When we talked about the rich young man a couple of weeks ago, listen, rich people aren't greedy. Self-centered people are greedy. That's just the reality. And so we're going to deal with self-centered individuals today. And I hope you can go on this journey with me and understand that as we challenged you last week to live with margin and live on mission, as we did that, we said that if you establish your priorities, then you're going to get a lot of things that are the desires of your heart. But prioritize them. with the margin of your life. So last week we talked about the margin. Today we're going to talk about the mission. And if Jesus said it this way, remember, I don't want you to forget this part. What is it that you treasure? Because where your heart is, what did he say about that? Because your heart is going to follow your treasure. Whatever you put your treasure at, that's where your heart is going to follow. So what you're spending your money on, so if you're spending your money on that house in Oklahoma City, then where's your heart going to, or your heart's going to be there. So if you're here for the weekend, great. But you're thinking about your money and your possessions and your stuff. That's what we're doing. So what is it that you treasure? And I think maybe a better question might be this. What is your life producing? Think about it. Where you are right now. What are we producing? What is our fruit? Because some of us might not be rich by the world standards, but we're producing a lot more than you're giving yourself credit for. And Jesus is saying, good job. Well done. And some of us are very rich by bank standards, and we're not producing a whole lot. We don't have a lot to show for it, and you want to look back and look at something different. So that's what we're really going to do. We're going to see this shift in where Jesus was trying to take culture in Matthew 25, and Jesus goes on. He's going to tell this story as he's coming to the very end of his life, just to kind of set up what's going on here. He's coming to the end of his life, and he's preparing his disciples, and he's telling them, this is what's happening. There's all this kingdom of heaven stuff. Kingdom of heaven this, kingdom of heaven that. What's going to happen whenever I'm not here anymore? I want you to know what the kingdom of heaven looks like here on earth. So we're going to jump into one of these stories, and that story is the parable of the talents. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. It's a pretty famous parable. So even if you're not a Bible person, you haven't spent most of your life in the Bible, you may have heard at least a little bit about this. Very famous, might sound familiar, and Jesus begins by telling the story. This is what he says. Again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. Let me just talk about the kingdom of heaven just for a real quick second. We're not talking about life after death here. Jesus is talking about there is a kingdom of heaven here on earth. And honestly, here, these people in here, people who call themselves Jesus followers, we're the ones that provide the kingdom of heaven for the earth. By the way we live, by the way we love each other, by the way we give generously to each other, by the way we help our communities out and we serve one another, or we pick up our neighbor's yard or this or whatever. When you start to see the niceties of this world, all the great things of this world, it's because there's Christians in the world who are making a difference in our culture. That's how Christianity burst on the scene back in the early first century, whenever it changed Rome. And the hospitals were established by Christians because they cared for the sick and the needy. And you have the Salvation Army projects this week and this season. Those were Christian organizations. That's kingdom of heaven here on earth. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about life after death. And if we do our jobs as Christians, which I pray that we do every day, it's a kingdom of love and hope and generosity and compassion and truth, all that stuff. That's what we want. That's what Jesus wants. And sometimes we don't do a very good job of that as Christians. And I hope we can change some of that with this church. But it's still here. The kingdom of heaven is still here. And Jesus says the more we yield to his message, the more we'll see that on earth. Now, so he says, I'm going to tell you a story about this man who goes on this long trip. And this is what it says. It says he called together his servants. Now, this is the story part. He called together his servants and entrusted his money to them while he was gone. So here's what this verse right here tells us about this. It says that what the money in this story is entrusted to them. It's not theirs, it's his, right? So here's a hint. That's the reality for all the possessions, all the money that you and I have, right? Everything I have is not mine, it's his. I am entrusted this stuff, this money, these possessions, everything that you're a self-made man or whatever. Hey, God bless you for thinking that, but you didn't make yourself. God made you. God made me. God created us, and he created everything in this world. And if I have money, it's because he's given me money, and he's entrusted something to me. Same thing for you. Same thing for the people in this story. He's entrusted him with his money while he was gone. So this is what's going on here. The next part of this says everything that's about to blow our minds. All right, he gave 5 bags of silver to one, 2 bags of silver to another, 1 bag of silver to the last, divided it in proportion to their abilities. Then he left on his trip. Now, let's just break down what these bags of silver are. There's a Greek word for this and for bags of silver. Some of it is where we get the name, parable of the talents. That word bags of silver is a talent. Well, what does that mean? I thought talent meant like it's a gift or it's an ability that God has given me. Well, that's the word we've made it into in America or in English, right? That's our word for it. The actual Greek word for this is talent. It was a unit of currency. A talent was a measurement of currency, a unit of currency. And the best way to try to describe it would be to use inflation to today. And this is what a lot of people have studied up, and what it kind of amounts to, and it's a really easy math equation, is that 1 talent would have equaled about $1 million. That's crazy. So one bag of silver would have been about $1 million. Now, that's the inflation today. I don't know how much silver costs. Some of you might be storing away silver. That's fine. Or gold. Put whatever it is. But this is easy for us to understand the amount of money that we have been entrusted. So one of them got $5 million. One of them got $2 million. And one of them got $1 million. Okay? That's what's going on here. And this is this message for all of us that walk the earth. We have all been entrusted some amount. That's the parable. That's what he's trying to teach here. So this is what's going on. I want you to look at this next verse because it talks about what the servants did. The servant who received $5 million began to invest the money and earned 5 more. So it's pretty clear what's happening here. That at the beginning, Jesus says, I'm going to give you some money. I'm going to give you some talents. I'm going to give you all this stuff, and I want you to put it to work. And this is what's happening here. By the way, the master in the story should have been well known, is really kind of pointing to God, pointing to Jesus, God in the story. So the servant who got 5 bags earned 5 more. $5 million. He went and invested it, and he got 5 more, so he came back with 10. Next part of the parable says this. It says, the servant with 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned 2 more. But the servant who received the 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. So you see what's happening here. And I think, man, this is interesting. This is a little bit different than the first 2, right? This is the point of why Jesus is telling the story, because this is who some of us are with our greed. That's kind of what this is pointing to. Some of us, why would this happen? Because what we talked about week 1, some of this happens because trust. We don't trust God with his own money. We don't do it. That's our fault. And Jesus is telling us this story about how we treat what he's already entrusted to us. And this is the fear that we have, is that God's not going to be nice with what he's already given us. So we start to hoard it and look at it on our own means. So this guy with the 1 bag of money just says, I'm going to hide it, and goes on to say this about the story. After a long time, which, by the way, anybody ready for Jesus to come back? Yeah. Feels like a long time. Yeah, it has been a long time, over 2,000 years, but that's no different than this story says. After a long time, their master returned from his trip, called them to give an account of how they had used his money. Really straightforward, really simple to understand. We're not hiding anything here. Think at the end of your life, he's going to call us and ask for an account of how we had used his money, how we have used what he has entrusted to us. And I think this is what Jesus is going to say to us. I think he's really going to say 2 things at the end of our lives and whenever we meet him, because we're going to, whether we're a Jesus follower or not, we will meet God. We will meet our maker, right? And he's going to ask us 2 questions. 1, what did you do with Jesus? What did you do with Jesus? That's the salvation question, right? What did you do with him? Because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And there is no way to God except for through him. We tried to do whatever we could to erase our sin on our own, but we can't, which is why God sent Jesus to the cross to die for us, all right? He was the salvation that we needed, and we need to accept that atonement for our lives. That's the question. So if that's what you need to answer today, that's great. That's all you need to hear. What are you going to do with Jesus? But the other question is this. What are you going to do with what he's entrusted you with? I think that's a huge one. What did you do with your skills and abilities? What did you do with your money? What did you do with what you've been given? So in the story, this master calls uh, all of them to give an account of what was going on. This is what we start to see. The servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 5 more. So pretty simple what's going on there so far. But then he goes on to say, the master was full of praise. This is how God treats us when we do this type of work. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount. So now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. I can't help but to realize this right here. Small amount, $5 million. Anybody think $5 million, small amount? If you do, don't raise your hand because someone might mug you on the way out. But that's crazy for us to think about. But in Jesus' mind, in God's mind, $5 million is nothing compared to eternity. Right? It's nothing compared to what you will have later on. You know, and it continues on the same pattern. I want you to read this in 22. The servant who had received the 2 bags of silver, $2 billion, came forward and said, Master, you gave me 2 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 2 more. What's he say next? You can almost guess. The master said, well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount. Still no small amount, but it is to him. So now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. So we're reading, and what I want you to realize, if you're going through a hard copy Bible, it's the exact same sentence structure. Don't miss this. He's being very consistent by the pattern of what these people had done, what these guys had done. And exact same words, identical, same thing here. So you can almost guess what would have happened if the one with 1 produced another 1, right? You can almost guess. But this is what happens. It says this. The servant with the 1 bag of silver came and said, you're like, man, if this guy, of course, we already knew what happened. He had hit it and dug a hole, put it in the ground. You already know. It was like, man, if he just would have done that, he would have said, well done, good and faithful servant. I will give you many more responsibilities since you did something with this small amount. That's what he would have done. And that's what he's telling us today. And you're thinking, what more responsibilities will I have? And I promise you, it's not just on this earth. I think he looks at us in the next life as well and says, you're still going to have responsibilities in the next. So when you start to hear people say, oh, you got a crown or a jewel in your crown in heaven or whatever, it's like, well, more of those jewels are just responsibilities. And God sees us. You may have done something with the salvation question, but if you did something with the entrusted question, then maybe he's going to give you even more responsibilities in heaven. That's a very tough thing to try to figure out, and a whole series on heaven would probably do us some good in here. But I want you to understand, he could have said, let's celebrate together, but this is what happened instead. Master, I knew you were a harsh man. Harvesting crops you didn't plant, gathering crops you didn't cultivate. And this is where I just start to get a little bit nervous for this guy. But he continues to dig this hole. He says, I was afraid I would lose your money. So I hid it in the earth. Look, here's your money back. And you're like, oh, okay, at least he got his money back. But that's not the way the master treated him. And I think we see this harsh, or I was afraid. It goes back to that trust thing again, church. Sometimes we don't trust God with what he's already given us. Remember, we talked about not believing that God will do everything good. This is a great illustration of that. So here's what he says. The master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. If you knew I harvested crops and you knew I didn't plant and gather crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you just deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it. That sounds like a modern day thing, right? But this is what God was telling his people then. You know, if you're not going to do anything, at least let the world do something for it. If you, Jesus follower, if you, kingdom of heaven, citizen, if you're not going to do anything with it, the world could have done something better with my money than you did. This is a good, like, stop yourself in your tracks and say, my goodness, what did I do wrong? Think about it this way. If you had, actually, let me read one more verse. That he ordered, and take the money from this servant, give it to one with the 10 bags of silver. I love that it kind of comes to a completion here. He's like, I don't want you to touch my money again. I want you to give it to somebody who's doing something with it. I was thinking about this, like if you had a financial advisor, maybe some of us in here do, right? And you take some of the money that you have and you want to put it away, or you want to build some interest on it. Here's what I think. If you, let's say you had $10,000, right? And the markets are bad one year, and then your financial advisor comes back and said, well, we only got 7,000 left because I took 2,000 for myself because I'm the one that's managing your money, and this is what I got left. First year, you might be like, okay, I understand the markets were bad. It wasn't that great. But if he does that again and comes back and said, I didn't make any money on it, you know what you're going to do to that financial advisor? You're going to say, okay, you're gone. We're not doing this anymore. I'll find somebody new. That's exactly what the master is doing to the servant here. If you're not doing anything with what God has entrusted you, he's going to give that to somebody else. He's going to give this blessing opportunity to somebody else. Think about what God has given you today. What has he given me? And if I realize, man, I'm not getting many opportunities here with money, what am I got nobody to blame but myself. Because I'm the one that look at myself all the time. I'm the one that's getting greedy. So let's not get mad at God here. We're the ones that aren't completing the pattern. But then he says this. He says, to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given. That's a great promise, right? That's a promise for us to hear. You use well what you've been given, even more will be given. And they will have an abundance. This awesome life with margin, right? But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. And then the teaching gets real tough because you hear something you don't ever like to hear. Now throw this useless servant into the outer darkness. Sounds like throw him in hell, but that's not really what that is. Just into the wasteland is basically what it says. Where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that sounds miserable. But really, it's just kind of like this point of regret. He's going to regret what he didn't do. And he's just going to, oh my gosh, and he's just going to stew over it over and over again. And that's what God promises. I promise you, you will have an abundance if you do great things, but I also promise you that there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth and regret if you don't do anything good with what I've given you. So just take a breath here and start to realize, okay, so what's the whole point of the story? What are we talking about here? Why are we talking about this? I think this is the biggest point of the story. Jesus asked you to be generous with what you have, not with what you don't have. And maybe the guy with one talent said, I don't have another million like this guy with the 2 bags. I don't have another 4 million like this guy with the 5 bags. So he decided not to be generous with what he didn't have. And I think Jesus really does tell us this. I think this is true. I think most of us in here, myself included, we want to be generous people. We really do. But we make up excuses for why we're not. Because I only make this, and here's my budget, and I don't have room to do this or that or whatever. What do you have, and what can you do with what you have? Regardless of the number. It can have 7 digits on your salary, or 6 or 5. What do you do with what you have? You know, and I think most of us in here want to do that. We want to be more like Mother Teresa than the arms dealer, okay? That's what we want to do. But sometimes we don't live our lives that way. We're worried about the bills. We're worried about the credit card. We're worried about the kids' activities. We're worried about you fill in the blank, and we're not seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness. We're thinking about all the other things, right? We're thinking about all the other things. And Jesus says, I know, I get that. But I want you to start where you are. I want you to do this one step at a time. I want you to start with what you have. And that's kind of the biggest point of the story. Start where you are. And I hope you're realizing this. This is not I'm not scolding you. I want to go through this with you. Because I've been through this mess of not starting where I am. I've been through this wallowing before. I've been the servant with the 1 talent. And I've hit it before. And my life has had to change since then. Like I said, I come to this point of realization. I have been a greedy person in my life, and I want to change that. And I want to be on the way to where I'm being generous with the things that I have. And I think you do too. You know, we have this couple here in the church. I asked a few months ago to remind us about what God has asked them to do. because I've seen this in them, and I think it's awesome to see these things. We sat down with them a couple months ago, asked them a few questions about their journey of faith into generosity, and I want you just to hear a few minutes of what they have to say.
So I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
And we have been at Ridge Christian for how many years?
4,
5, maybe more. We have 2 girls, Ellie, who is a part of the high school youth group, and then Hannah, who is a part of the junior high youth group. So, and I work with the youth on Wednesdays, and
I work with the youth on Wednesdays also, and part of the worship team on Sundays.
And I am not part of the
So the value that sticks out the most to us and to our family is the next generation is worth our sacrifice. We just try to help out with the youth and whatnot, because we know investing in these kids is important.
Yeah, we've been with youth a long time. We've probably been in youth work for 20 plus years, so they're definitely where our heart is at.
It's something that's always been modeled in our lives, from our parents to us now, and we view it as a very important part of our life. It's in Scripture as something that Christ calls us out to do, and is to give back.
And it just brings a lot of joy, and giving is something that I think you always get more than you give, for sure. And so it's a fun way to walk in your faith, because you're always gonna see Him bless it.
But the reality of it is in Malachi 3:10, it's the only place where God ever actually asks us to test Him in something, and it's related to giving. And because we've been faithful and obedient in that, He's taking care of us. It says, He says, test me in this, if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven. And so, that doesn't mean He's going to make us rich or anything, but He definitely blesses us and our family because of the obedience of giving.
Well, and I think too with giving, definitely because we're called to, and it's walking in obedience, but also just because I think when you give, you have to, it just forces us to recognize that it's not ours anyway. So when you give, you're walking in obedience, but it's also it's such a reminder that we don't find security in this world, in our bank accounts, and what's in our savings, in our home, in anything, in our jobs. Like, if we're resting on that for our security, it's always going to feel like shaky ground. And so I think when you start to give, it's just a reminder, like, He doesn't need us to give because He needs what we give. He's asking us to give as a reminder that it's His anyway, and it's not where we find our security. So I think when you take that step of faith and you start to give, even when it feels like it's going to hurt or it's going to be hard, or you wonder how that bill is going to get paid, or whatever it is, it really is, it's a step in your faith walk with Him. It's reminding yourself that He's your security, and you can just be at peace knowing that He will open the floodgates of heaven, and He'll always show up when you're walking in obedience. So
words of encouragement, it's a tough thing to step out and do if you're not already doing it, because I know so many people live paycheck to paycheck as it is, and to give up that 10% it's hard to fathom. But again, the word of encouragement is once again, when it comes to giving, it's the only place in Scripture that God tells us to test Him, right? We shouldn't test Him any other way, right? With anything, but to give, it is that challenge that He puts out there, and it is to open the floodgates of heaven. And so my challenge is to believe in that, and to start. A tithe is technically 10%, right? So do I say start with that? Start with something, right? Start with that challenge and work to what it is to follow in obedience to God, to do that tithe.
And He'll show up in crazy ways, and you'll see Him, and you'll be like, yeah, He came through.
We asked the Fosters, approached them those a number of months ago now, because we've seen the way they live, and you know what? I don't want to single them out. We've seen the way many of you live, and we thank you for that. We see the way that many of you give and are sacrificing of yourself for the sake of others, whether that's the next generation, whether that's the people in this body, whether that's the people that are impoverished down the street, whoever it may be. There's a reason that we think beyond ourselves and we don't accumulate things for ourselves. We got dozens of families who are setting the tone of generosity and sacrifice in this community, and I thank you for that. And I think that there's a path for this church to make an impact in the community in ways that we have barely scratched the surface. So the way that you love people, the way that we love people in our community gives me hope. Gives me hope, and I know that Jesus is going to say to many of us that same thing that he said, well done, my good and faithful servant. I will give you, because you handled this small amount, I will give you many more responsibilities as well. And I love that last part. Let's celebrate together. It is the cause of our worship. The stories of sacrifice inspire me a lot more than anybody's story of accumulation. And so the question for us all is this, and this is the last question I'll ask as we kind of close this out. What will your legacy be? What is it now? Where is it headed now? And where will it be? We're not saying that you can't have stuff. I'm not giving you permission or anything for whatever. It's not about me. I'm just saying, what is your legacy going to be? Because here's this week, here's what I want you to do. Start, just like what Chris said in that video, start with what you have. Start somewhere. Start with where we are. Start with where we are. Whether that's here or anywhere else in the community, how will you take what God has given you and make more about him than about ourselves? God has provided us something to be entrusted with. Thank God for that he wants us to be a part of his plan. So let's understand that it is his, and we have a great opportunity to make it more about him than to make it about us. Let's give God our praise and thanks and celebrate together with him today. God, thank you for your example in Scripture, the reminder, the teaching. Thank you for that. Thank you for the reminders of your people here amongst us. Thank you for that. Thank you for the silent stories that nobody knows about. I know it's uncomfortable for me to ask someone to share a story, so I thank you for people who do, because that testimony, that witnessing of what you've done is important for other people who might not trust you yet. And God, help me trust you even more. Help my friends trust you with what you've given them. Help us all to be on mission today. Help us help other people follow Jesus and make your name famous along the way. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.